Welcome to another topic in ethics. Today we'll talk about a very famous piece of software and hardware called the EthicsTheracparta. The article we'll be using this first cut is called Killed by a Machine, the EthicsTheracparta. So this is a tiny little cartoon of the Therac. The Therac was a radiation therapy machine. It was used to kill cancer cells. It was quite a long time ago, so the exposure was quite large and not as directed as the beams are today. So the patients in general were already exposed to more radiation than we wished them to be. The radiation would also kill tissue around the cancer cells, not just the cancer cells. Today's machines are much more focused, but the Therac is a very good example of what can go wrong with software, and I'm also going to show you an example of what can go wrong with hardware. The EthicsTheracparta is one of the most well-known software bugs and most documented. Many universities use it as a cautionary tale of what can go wrong and how investigations can be led astray. Much of the research work on what happened to the Therac and the reason it's so famous is because Nancy Levinson did some research on it and published it. She was a software safety expert who searched these incidences and studied the lawsuits that resulted as well. So much of the information that you will find on the Therac will be the same because it will be from her research from 2 papers and also a book. The EthicsTheracparta was manufactured by the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, AECL. It was the third of their radiation therapy machines. Previous was the Therac 6 and the Therac 20. These previous machines play a large part in the problems. The AECL built the Therac 6 and 20 with a French company, but in the Therac 25 design, they did not cooperate with the French company. However, both companies had access to the designs and source codes of the earlier machine. The Therac 20 code base was developed from the Therac 6. All 3 of the machines used a PDP-11. You guys don't know the PDP-11, but I can tell you it was a sweet, sweet computer. And in fact, a better microcontroller could not have been purchased at the time. So the hardware of the computer was not the issue. The machine, and I'll look at this picture right here, had a turntable assembly. And the patient is lying here on a table. And then the X-ray machine is brought into where their cancer cells are. And the machine had 3 options. It had an electron mode scan magnet, and this would scatter the electrons to make a wide, not concentrated dosage of radiation. So that was the electron mode. If you put it in the X-ray mode, it had a blockage. You would give it more power for the actual beam, but only the X-rays that went through this small circle would actually impact the patient. The rest of this was shielded. So this was for as detailed as you could to get straight to particular known cancer cells. And this was a mirror. And the purpose for the mirror was to reflect back. And as soon as you got the reflection, the software would know that it was in a non-operable state. These devices here were supposed to lock into place with the switches, with the actuators. There were 3 of them. So just like, I don't know if any of you guys use a food processor. When you put the food processor in, it has to click into the exact place before the machine will turn on. So it's not clear what happened if any of these other places, it's undefined by the software details, what will happen in these other places if these do not click exactly into place. The Therac 6 and 20 both operated as standalone devices. In manual mode, a radiotherapy technician would set up the devices needed, including choosing the turntable modes. On the Therac 6 and 20, there were hardware interlocks that would stop the operation, just like on a food processor, if something wasn't perfectly aligned. So on the previous two, they had hardware interlocks that prevented the operator from doing something dangerous, like selecting a high-powered electron beam without the X-ray target in place. In the previous machines, if you did that, they would blow a fuse. So attempting to activate the accelerator in an invalid mode would blow a fuse, bringing everything to a halt. The PDP-11 and its hardware were added simply as a convenience. A VT100 terminal, you guys probably don't know what that means. When we first had smart terminals instead of dumb terminals, the VT100 was a terminal emulation program. So almost every terminal was a VT100 terminal. It just means they were running a terminal emulator that every other piece of hardware could talk to. So with the PDP-11 and the VT100 terminal, the computer used servos to position the turntable and other devices. Hospitals, when they got the Therac 25, loved the fact that the computer set it up and a human being didn't have to do it. It saved time. For the Therac 25, AECL decided to go with computer control only. They took out many of the manual controls and also the hardware interlocks. It is not at all clear why this company took out the hardware interlocks. They were a safety feature. The important detail here is when they moved to another step, they removed the safety details. They removed them because they thought the software would never have the same problem that a human did when setting up the machine. Remember this. This is the very first step from manual to computerized, and they didn't think they needed the hardware interlocks. Instead of keeping them and making sure that they didn't need them, they got rid of them as soon as they were going to computer control. So the idea was that the computer would keep track of the machine setup and shut things down if they detected a dangerous situation. The Therac went into service in 1983. For several years and thousands of patients, they had no issues. Then on June 3rd, 1985, a woman was being treated for breast cancer. She had been prescribed 20 RADs, 20 radiation-absorbed doses, in the form of one 10-megavolt electron beam. When they turned on the machine, the patient felt a tremendous heat. It wasn't known at the time, but she received somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 RADs. She lived, but she lost her left breast and the use of her left arm from the radiation burns. In July 26, notice how carefully after this is quite interesting to me. On July 26, a second patient is burned in the Ontario Cancer Foundation in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. This patient dies in November. Autopsy showed that the death was from particularly aggressive cancer, but if she had lived, she would have had to have her hips completely replaced from the radiation damage. Now in December, 2 years later, 85, a third woman is burned by this machine in Yakima, Washington. She develops a striped burn pattern on her hip, which very closely matches the beam blocking strips on the Therac 25. They should have known it was out of alignment then, when it looked just like the turntable out of alignment. This patient lived, but eventually needed skin grafts to close the wounds that wouldn't heal by themselves from the radiation burns. A year later, a patient in Tyler, Texas, is scheduled to receive his 9th Therac 25 treatment. He is prescribed 180 rads to a small tumor on his back. When the machine turns on, he feels heat and pain, which was unexpected. He'd already had 8, and previous ones were painless. The Therac 25 itself also started buzzing in an unusual way. The patient tried to get up off the table when a second pulse of radiation hit him. After he recovered, he did get up and started banging on the door for help. He had received a massive overdose of radiation and was hospitalized for radiation sickness, dying 5 months later. On April 11, 1986, just a month later, a second accident occurs again in Tyler, Texas. So the same place 1 month in afterwards. This time the patient is being treated for skin cancer on the ear. The same operator, the exact same operator, is running the machine as in the March 21st accident. When the therapy started, the patient saw a bright light and heard what he described as eggs frying. He said he felt like his face was on fire. This patient died 3 weeks later due to the radiation burns on his right temporal lobe, the brain, and the brainstem. The final overdose occurred much later in 87, again at Yakima Valley Hospital in January. That patient also died from his injuries. So we're going to stop this introduction and go to the second video.